Radio Okitalk, Radio Okitalk, von Mensch zu Mensch.
Welcome to Team Rabbit Hole Edition 168, flowing in info with Wally, Scharold. Information is God, perceiving, receiving, and achieving flow in the Tao. Synchromysticism and its differences at the micro and the macro level. These are a few things that this Aquarius wants to chat about, so we shall. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
For sure, dude. Raphael, I was going to say that was very bombastic, but it felt like, I don't know, it felt like when you see, I mean, it is what it is, it's like symphonic, kind of, 18th century European classical music, but with like technologically superior stuff being applied, so it feels kind of an odd juxtaposition. We can get into dissecting that, but real quick, what we tend to do at the beginning of these episodes is talk about the cards in the Major Arcana and the Galactic Heritage card deck that this synchronizes with. This card will be the 15 card in the Major Arcana, the Devil card. I'm the Master Deceiver, and it is time to break the spell. This is about embracing your inner trickster, giving in to temptation, making choices based on impulse rather than desire, deceiving yourself, and feeling hopeless. Raphael, what would the Galactic Heritage be?
Here we got number 60. This is Sirius coming full circle, present timeline. In the ancient days, the Syrians placed codes within our DNA to help us evolve when the time was right. That time is now. Humankind is awakening as the Syrians had hoped. Their task has come full circle. If you pulled this card, then you have a connection to that ancient Syrian past, and because of humankind's awakening, you have recently completed a karmic pattern held for thousands of years. You may feel subtle energies of completion, or you may feel nothing at all. But if you have any guilt about things left undone in the ancient past, it is not necessary to hold that pattern any longer.
So out of curiosity, Wally, did either of those cards resonate?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of, well, it's funny that you mentioned impulse as opposed to desire. I tend to kind of equate the two at times. At least my impulses seem to be based in my desires. But just in the last several weeks, I've consciously relinquished certain vices of mine that were very much, or one of which was very much based on deep desires, but that was decades old and was actually not really very fruitful for me at all. But that seemed to trigger a kind of crack in the universal egg and led me on a very kind of life-altering path just in the last several weeks. So,
well, that's what's up.
Yeah, it's been pretty amazing.
We'll go in full circle on that one. I don't know what you're particularly talking about, but I mean, for example, I used to grow cannabis and stuff like that and smoke most of my life, and I don't now. And
that was one of them for me too.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think it's beautiful. I think it's helpful. I think it's medicinal. I'm always going to be pro cannabis, but at some level, it felt like my impulse to do something was actually trumping, in a sense, or transcending my heart's desires or my ultimate my higher will, or however one wants to put that. In some weird paradoxical way, they're kind of, it doesn't matter maybe. It's enjoy the ride kind of stuff. But at the same time, there's a plethora of options and operating procedures that one can do. And yeah, it's tricky. It's funny when one comes full circle, something like that. And we tend to deceive ourselves. I mean, the devil is inside of us in that sense. So it's like, when it's like animalistic kind of urges, I think that's more the impulse where it's like, oh, my brain is saying to do this. And sometimes that's fine. And sometimes it's not. And people have to be discerning on their own terms. But because we want to follow our impulses and learn from our mistakes. So like always saying no and never trying things, I think is problematic. Yeah, eat the fruit. Eve, check it out, like see what happens. But at the same time, know that you're held responsible for the kind of consequences of your decisions, and maybe they're not in alignment with the mission you've signed up for, or your subconscious desires or whatever the fuck. Raphael, what did you think about those cards?
Oh, about the cards? Well,
yeah, or the situations we're kind of talking about.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's circles within circles and spirals and so on. The journey is different for everyone. Certainly, as we always repeat, discernment is key. And it's just like you said, also about saying no. This gets into, I guess, consciousness, sovereignty, or even just psychology. There's different perspectives, but the one idea being that the conscious aspect of ourselves actually mainly is, or at least also there as a control mechanism to actually say no. So to filter all impulses through and then see which one to grant, in a sense. So yeah, there's a lot there. And I guess, it's always good if individuals find higher levels of balance, whatever this may mean to themselves, right?
That's what's up.
Right on.
Wally, last time you were on here, it was a shit show. There was way too many cooks in the kitchen, and we even had,
all good.
Well, it's just funny. I'm musing on that fact. It's been a while. We're already at 170 about, and that was 100th episode, so we're still trucking through it. But
yeah, it's great.
That was bizarre. We don't have to talk about that right now, but I'm kind of curious. First, before I totally tangent out, what were your thoughts on that music? Because you kind of heard what I was saying. It felt like this kind of weird Fabergé egg of ancient techniques with modern tools or something.
Yeah, it was just kind of a mixture of of classical and electronica. I mean, it's fun. It's nothing that new, actually. I mean, you could even trace the origins of that type of hybrid back to a fifth of Beethoven. That disco
version
version of Beethoven's Fifth. That type of, and even further back, you could look at Wendy Carlos, the synthesizer pioneer, who did that album Switched on Bach, which was something that, it was basically playing Bach pieces on a Moog synthesizer. And I think some of that was used in 2001, Space Odyssey. But yeah, so I mean, that's a tradition all in its own,
I think it makes me cringe. I don't know why. It feels disingenuous to both electronic music, at least in that context. That's why I was like, I wonder why Raphael picked that. I don't care. He's a Libra with a North Node Aquarius. He can do what he wants, obviously. But at some level, I was like, this sounds like a bad Final Fantasy 20 soundtrack or something.
Yeah, it doesn't bother me. I mean, I don't know how much you know about my music, my creative music work, but it is all about a massive boiling pot of genres and acknowledging all of musical history, kind of usually within one song, and an appreciation for the full spectrum of musical culture, whether it's high or low. I mean, I don't really see any distinction. I find really complicated intellectual music just as important as really simple popular music.
So from Beethoven to kazoo orchestras, it's all good.
Yeah.
That's what's up. Yeah, when you said neither high nor low brow, it made me think of Pink from The Wall shaving off his eyebrows. It's like, perfect. We have no eyebrows on this one. That's all good. And it's very Aquarian. And it's funny that you say that Beethoven's Fifth, the disco version, because when I was a kid, I mean, I'm 35 now, but when I was 5, my dad got this CD sampler of classical music, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, all this kind of stuff like that. And they had Beethoven's Fifth, but it was the disco version. And I don't know if that was an Easter egg or an accident or intentional or what, but it was literally, straight up serious classical music and then da 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 or whatever. And we were always like, this is so funky.
Yeah, I enjoy that track. I always thought it was fun. It's funky.
That little keyboard solo is dope.
Yeah.
I mean, it's super funky, but at the same time, it's whatever. It is what it is. It's kind of funny because I guess culture has to kind of crawl through evolution, but then at some point it becomes almost kitschy in a way. So it's that's kind of what I was saying about this stuff, where it's that might have been cool in 1995 or something, early on or earlier. But to me, at some level, it felt like I don't know, odd, but I don't hate it, but I don't love it. You see my point, life. Anyway, I know a little about your music career, but I just kind of want to get on record as much or as little as you want to talk about where you came from, how you got here. I know we met
Sure.
up before in Boise and did the Sync Summit thing. That was a lot of fun. In fact, I'm going to link people to your contact presentation because I thought that was fascinating in and of itself. And anybody who's into Jodie Foster's contact film should definitely check this shit out. It's heavy, heady, weird shit, synchromistic stuffs. But kind of walk me through how you are, what you is.
Sure. Well, born and raised in Houston, Texas, and was pretty aimless through most of my youth, and discovered at a relatively late age that I was fortunate enough to be given some musical talent, and immersed myself in that world pretty much ever since. A little less recently, but
how did you stumble upon that? Were you like, oh, fiddle on a guitar, or like were you singing in perfect pitch in choir?
I no, I don't have perfect pitch. I have excellent relative pitch, which is almost as the next best thing. But that's just from years of training. I did sing. That was kind of my first instrument. I sang in choirs and musicals, and then got a guitar when I was 10 or 11 years old, and slowly but surely got a little bit better and better at that. And by the time I was probably 15 or 16, I had a teacher who recognized that, or acknowledged the fact that I was writing my own music on guitar that was not necessarily just
it's beyond Stairway. You're doing
yeah. I mean, just instrumental pieces, that were. I never really got into the kind of singer-songwriter thing, like, learning a few chords and then writing lyrics and singing over it. That was never really my thing. I liked to just write stuff on the guitar that sounded good to me. And this teacher I had, her education was in composition, and she really encouraged me to explore music, just music composition as a wider topic, even beyond the guitar. And from there, I just kind of kept, finding myself in more and more advanced types of music courses, or like summer camps or whatever, through the rest of my high school years, until I finally, my last year of high school, actually my 5th year of high school, which is a long story. I went to, in Houston, Texas, a school called the High School for the Performing and Visual Arts, which is kind of like, right out of like that show Fame. It's like an arts high school. One of probably the most famous person that came out of there is Beyonce.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, she was there when I was there. I never really met her, but she was a couple years behind me.
You were in the quarter shredding guitar, and she's like,
well, she was hardly ever there. Because she was already kind of, I think Destiny's Child already existed by then, or she was doing something already, but she was enrolled there. And a couple other, in the jazz community, people who have come out of there have gone on to fame and fortune. And so I was there as a jazz guitar player, although I never really invested myself in jazz. By the time I actually started going there, I was already very much interested in composition, classical, like modern classical, and just general composition, and got a composition private teacher, and then found myself applying to music schools for college, and went to Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio, where I got a bachelor's in composition. And then I moved out to Oakland, California for graduate school at a little college called Mills College, and stayed out there and simultaneously got immersed in 2 different scenes. One was my kind of professional life, which was doing music and sound design and just general audio production for multimedia, video games, stuff like that, which is what I still do for a job. I've been doing that for 17 years now.
So like the name Nobuo Uematsu or whatever, Final Fantasy dude, you know who he is. I mean, you're going to know a lot more about the fucking reality of that stuff, but video game music is fucking dope. So cool. I mean,
yeah,
I think I knew
it's
you
a
did that,
huge,
but I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's a huge world. Yeah, that's my day job. I do less famous stuff than that. I mean, there's a zillion game companies out there, and I've done a couple jobs, just one-off jobs on larger kind of AAA titles. Like I worked on a Guitar Hero game, not as a composer, but actually transcribing the music that you play in the game and then programming it for like the way the gems fall down the lane and with your fingers. Yeah, that was a job I had. I did that for the Van Halen edition of Guitar Hero.
Speaking of which, R.I.P. Eddie.
I know. Yep, I met him in the process.
Dude, how is he cool? Was he cool?
Yeah, he was very friendly. I mean, it was pretty brief, but
still, it's always fun to meet interesting monkeys on the spinning rock.
Absolutely. And as a guitarist,
yeah,
he's an icon. Obviously, we don't need to belabor that point any more than anyone else has. But for the last 9.5 years, I've been doing composition and sound design for online games, and it's fun. It really allows me to kind of stretch my versatility and having to write in a lot of styles that I would not even go out of my way to listen to, but I'm forced to try to compose and create a music in a style that in an authentic way, so that as if I did like that music and make it sound authentic to someone who does like that music, which is a great challenge. And
ultimate moccasining in that sense.
Ultimate what?
Moccasining. Moccasin, okay. Like wearing the shoes. It's like, I don't love this style.
Yeah, exactly. It's had an interesting effect on my general perception of music, because like you kind of, you do that, you've done it, you do it as long as I've done it, and you kind of get this numbing effect in terms of like your personal emotional response to all different styles. Like people, like just like you were saying, like certain things make you cringe and other things make you, very happy. For me, I've had to almost like turn off that kind of instinctual response to music, because I'm working in all of these styles that would make me cringe, but I have to like internalize them anyway and learn to appreciate them. And it's been fun. I mean, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it messes with your head a little bit after many years.
I mean, does it make you jaded, or how would you qualify that? Like, do you just like Pavlov would be like, oh shit, he doesn't respond the same way, or how are you dissecting this?
I've had periods of jadedness, yes. But I mean, where I'm at right now in my life, music is not central to me. It's become kind of something that it's a job. I don't spend almost any time listening to music for the pleasure of it, because I'm doing so much. I've spent so much time listening to music for work. So silence is actually preferable to me these days.
Interesting. What snaps you out of those jaded places? I mean, I guess you're not listening to, Beyonce's new thing, like Black is King has some interesting music on it, stuff like that. Is it the kind of thing where you just trained as a Spartan so hard that, to pick up the sword, you'll do it when you have to, and it's kind of that, I don't want to say ruined it, but it's like, it seems it's compartmentalized maybe that element of reality for you?
Compartmentalized is an excellent word to describe it. And I would say that it hasn't ruined it for me. I still get excited and I take great pride in the work that I do. It's not that I've trained my mind to and force myself to really appreciate every style of music. There are good and bad examples, right? And usually every genre has kind of an archetype, right? And it's and that archetype kind of came about before the name of the genre even existed. And then everyone came along and copied it, and thereby the genre term emerged, right? There's actually a great Herbie Hancock tune from the late 60s that I have identified as the archetype of Muzak. And I don't like Muzak. Most people don't like Muzak, but this piece is amazing. It's called Tell Me a Bedtime Story. Go listen to it. It's gorgeous. But it really sounds like what everyone else is copying when they're making Muzak, you know?
Herbie's one of my favorites. I used to drive around in high school to Thrust.
Thrust is such a, I love that album. It has one of the coolest album covers of all time. But I mean, as far as, you know, I could monopolize this talk with just music discussion, but I think what's relevant to the larger topics that this podcast is interested in is that starting in college, I was introduced to the kind of experimental and avant-garde realm of contemporary classical composition, which is, compared to the other fine arts like painting or literature or film or whatever, it's relatively obscure because most of it is very much an acquired taste to listen to. It's so abstract and crazy. But I mean, the equivalent of like Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism in film, in painting, it very much exists in avant-garde classical music. And
so, like Planet of the Apes soundtrack, or like, give me some examples of what you're talking about, because there's
I'm talking about like
super
well,
modern.
Planet of the Apes is skimming the surface. That's like, that would be
that's intro level.
Yeah, that's a commercial composer, you know, exercising his avant-garde chops. I would say, you know, that would be a light version of what I'm getting at. I mean, I can send you some links of some really intensely crazy stuff. And some of it is honestly unlistenable. You know, it's just
academic in that sense.
It's very, it's very academic. Yeah. But so there were a few individuals in that whole scene in the 20th century that really, you know, pushed the concept of composition and started breaking down just the very idea of composition and equating it to universal composition, just the nature, just the fundamental concepts underlying how all things come together and are connected.
It's like Schoenberg and 12-tone system stuff, it's like that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a precursor to what I'm talking about, but that was the beginning. That was the beginning. I would definitely identify that at Schoenberg as the first person who devised this system that completely broke away from the tradition of classical music, where you had a tune and a melody and it sounded relatively nice. You know, Schoenberg broke all of that apart and created this very mathematical system that was the underpinning of the structure of his piece of music. I mean, previously it was all about here, dun, 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 and then it goes dun, 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 dun. That little germ of an idea would be developed, you know, theme and variations throughout the whole course of the piece, right? And you would judge the integrity of a work on how well that had been carried out. And Schoenberg introduced a whole different system that produced very difficult music to listen to. But do
you think that's postmodernism rearing its head for the first time, kind of in that sense?
No, that's strictly modernism. Postmodernism and music. Postmodernism and music didn't emerge till the 60s. This is in the 1910s and 20s. I mean, it's kind of remarkable to consider. You go back over 100 years now and listen to the emergence of the musical avant-garde, and the stuff that they were doing even back then sounds completely bonkers today.
Still doesn't sit well with the general psyche.
No,
I'm kind of wondering what your impression of what it represented in the DAO at that time. That's kind of what I was getting at. Maybe it's not explicitly quote postmodern, but like, you know, the Rite of Spring or whatever made people riot, and then nowadays people are like, that's pretty cool. It's like,
well,
is it just
you know,
a mental, you know, eddy in the consciousness?
As a side note, that is a bit of a myth.
Oh
about
shit!
the Rite
Pop
of
the
Spring.
bubble.
It's true. A riot at the premiere, there was a riot, but it was not the music that caused the riot. It was the choreography.
Ah,
And in fact, the music was inaudible because people were screaming. You couldn't hear the music. It's a great legend that people love to tell, and I didn't learn the truth about it until I read, a lot about the history of that piece, and discovered that it was actually because of the original choreography of that ballet was completely groundbreaking. And if you see a reconstruction of the original choreography performed, it doesn't phase our eyes at all, because what it looks like is like a Janet Jackson video. The motion, the dancing is a very like angular and jagged kind of sync with the music, which was completely unheard of in ballet. Ballet dancing is usually this very
pirouettes
fluid,
and grace.
very fluid thing where you're not really seeing this tight connection with the rhythm of the music. And Rite of Spring is very rhythmic, and they're doing this stuff up there like and they're jerking around right in time with the music with these really like completely unorthodox movement. And it was also the subject matter of the ballet, a virgin sacrifice that people were objecting to. So it was the dance and the story that actually triggered the riot, because Stravinsky came back a year later to Paris and performed a music only version of the Rite of Spring, and they carried him out a hero. He was an instant celebrity. They loved the music. The music was not the trigger.
That's interesting. It reminds me a little of kind of like psychedelic music. The 60s can be put to like, very kind of multimedia sensorium kind of things like lava lamps, whatever. And it totally does change the experience. I mean, it can overwhelm and distract. It can also create, higher levels of aesthetic or something like that, synesthetic kind of stuff. So it's funny to think. I mean, Paris, one would think, especially at that time, was very, chic, cutting edge, whatever, like hip.
They were.
And for the whatever monkeys were having a bad day that day, started some shit. It seemed.
Right. Well, the thing is that music had already started to veer pretty, to the left into the out there realms 10 years prior to the Rite of Spring. Dance had not. The dance of that ballet really was a breakthrough, and nothing ever like it had ever been seen before. So, it's a common misconception. I mean, most people, it hasn't really been corrected in terms of like the public in the zeitgeist. It's still kind of,
it's fake news. It's still swimming around.
It's fake news. Yeah, exactly. Anyway,
that's something that we could tie it in. One thing that you talked about on SyncBook before, and it's fascinated me, is like information technology in the sense of degradation of info. And it's, in a sense, what you're kind of saying is like there's a truth, like something happened, and it's ironic because I think it's kind of like a hexagram that's not typical, and it popped up in that time space, but the myth of what happened is not at all. I mean, there's static on the wire, so to speak.
There's always noise.
Right.
There's always some noise element, and like when I learned about information theory and that like the science of information and how they basically proved that noise is an inescapable
it's
element.
Like data entropy.
Well, yeah, it will, no matter what, it will always be introduced into the transmission of information somehow. And noise, is often the interpretation of the term is often kind of too limited in its interpretation, that they just mean distortion or some kind of interruption of the signal or something like that. But what I mean as noise is as broad as you can imagine it. Anything that impedes your ability to convey an idea over some channel to a receiver. So whatever it can literally be something blocking your view, or it can be an object. It can be a piece of information you don't know. I mean, I've always talked about, the way that motion pictures were invented was because of noise, but a very figurative way, sense of the term. And that basically these two people placed a bet about whether or not when a horse is running, whether or not it lifts all four hooves off of the ground at the same time. So they invented, so these were two rich men in France, I believe, invented or set up this series of cameras, and took a rapid series of photographs of a horse running by this setup of cameras. And that literally was the primordial act that gave rise to the moving picture. And the noise in that scenario was their inability to see. I mean, literally, because like they're looking at the horse and they can't tell. And that's the noise. That's the thing that's impeding their ability for whatever the horse is doing, it's not getting to their eye properly. Something is getting in the way. And it just happened to be speed. The speed at which the horse was running was too fast. It was just a blur, right? So the limits of the capacity of the human eye was the noise in this equation. And so they solved that problem by relying on machines. But yeah, my interest in that has always been not communication as much as miscommunication. The causes of what are the causes of misperception or miscommunication, because something is always going to be lurking. It's the little demon that's always lurking and going to get in the way.
The devil in the details, per se. The devil.
Right.
I'm curious though. Do you presuppose that there is a and like what you're saying is kind of like there's just say, and then there's deviation from it, whether it's perceptible or whatever the issue seems to be, or do you think the nature of that thing is going from one pole to another pole of like absence of ness or something? Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, is there a black hole would be like complete noise, I guess, and it's just like, well, that's just the state of that pole, whereas a white hole,
that's a great way to put it. A black hole is almost a noise magnet. I mean, it's
chaos incarnate or whatever.
It's noise incarnate. It is the ultimate manifestation of noise because it erases information. In a sense, that's the only way that information is ever lost, is in a black hole, right? I mean, physical information. I'm not a physicist, obviously, but light. McLuhan called light pure information, right? And light is no match for a black hole. But I think what you're getting at is,
like, what's the necessity of each? Are we anthropomorphizing light as the good and like degradation as bad, or is that just like a frame in the 12-tone system, and it's like one of these fucking patchworks is the most chaotic and some of them are the least, and we tend to do better in certain situations where we can communicate effectively? But you see what I'm kind of saying? I'm not really making a moral judgment. I'm just kind of curious as what your presuppositional framework with that is, because I guess the idea with like science progress, technology, and even with the video, the origins of the motion picture, it's like we want to clarify something. Well, the case was the matter, and then they perceived a need to punctuate the moment's, like, I guess, parameters, and they used technology to do it, whatever. I wouldn't put a moral framework like it was. I mean, I guess a Buddhist or a Christian or something might say they were in ignorance and they rose out of the ignorance to a lesser degree of ignorance. But that starts spinning it in a more way as opposed to like the nature. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling, but you see what
I understand what you're saying, and I think it's appropriate not to apply a moral judgment on it. I mean, to put a Buddhist angle on it, you could say that suffering is noise. Suffering is something that is inevitable, right? And is something that we must come to terms with in life, just as much as there's always going to be some element of interference in anything that we try to do, because existence itself,
it could be interference by nature.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing.
In a Gnostic sense, it's like the light fell into the distortions.
We exist because of noise. Mutation is the introduction.
If I may, maybe to provide an interesting angle on this, in terms of, what is noise, it's fascinating to consider, there is always noise introduced because of our technology, even the way speech is structured, Tower of Babel, all of that. However, on the other side, let's say, of the polarity, as I understand, we also very much need noise, and as I understand, one of the ways is even through some kind of sound-based system that random numbers are actually generated through noise. I mean, there are technical implementations with coding, but ultimately there is also some variance where this is actually gained, I think, through actual sound patterns or something. I think now on modern computers, it's mostly a coding thing. But yeah, so I just want to say that although it's seen as a distortion, if you want to create randomness, it's also very important.
Absolutely. And I think that it's interesting. Well, I agree that we need noise. I was just saying noise is the fundamental driver of mutation in evolution. We're only here because of noise. And I think, what was I going to say? Well, it's interesting you bring up randomization, and it's because human beings are not necessarily comfortable with true randomness, because sometimes it doesn't appear random. Just by pure chance, something based on human pattern perception, it may seem unrandom, you know. And this is an actual thing that happened with Apple Computer. When they introduced the shuffle feature in iTunes, people complained too much that every now and then it would play like 3 songs in a row that were by this from like right off of the same album or right off of the same track order, and just by random chance. And so they actually had to adjust their shuffle algorithm to make it less random, because the human perception of randomness from time to time would not agree with this, you know, it's like, that's not random. That's 3 songs in a row from the same album, but it just randomly did that.
And they couldn't accept it. They're just like, this is
they couldn't accept it.
It's funny because this is the Devil Card episode that is a random punctuation of it in that mythology, where it's like, and the garden was perfect, and then all of a sudden, not so hot. You know, distortion in communication, lies, or what, you know, whatever the story says. And it's funny. That's kind of what I was getting at earlier, where it's like, some people would say, you know, we were like, in a Gnostic sense, maybe would be like, it was perfect, or even in a Tolkien kind of Silmarillion sense, it's like the song was perfect, and then this one dude started singing out of tune and tritones and all sorts of shit. And I think we're coming to a place in our own psychological evolution where we can accept the totality of it, and that maybe is the healthy place to be, as opposed to running like in the movie Hook, when Rufio is versus Peter Panning and they're trying to decide who to go. It's like, I think people tend to like do that with, I mean, I'm guilty of this too, with like preferences, where they say, we prefer this, like just like the Rites of Spring, they're like, or the Rite of Spring choreography rather, they were like, we don't prefer this, so they freaked out.
Right.
We're maybe coming to a point where we've evolved, you know, an ability. I don't know if it's going through the fucking cellulite of Kubrick or what defines it, you know, but like, it seems like we've gone through a Stargate of perception where we can accept chaos in a sense as a substrate.
Maybe. I mean, I have, you know, I think because chaos as a substrate, it perceptually would be information overload in a sense. I mean, I think, like you were talking about preferences and people being confronted with something that maximally, you know, overpowers their preferences. It triggers them into, you know, it agitates them into a state of rage. But also, like, when you think about, I have a theory, I have no idea if there's any medical basis in this, but the medical condition of shock, I think, is when a human being is exposed to an overdose of new information that they just cannot process. And that's the basis of information theory, is that the way you measure information is how much surprise it contains, how little versus redundancy, right? I mean, that's literally the method which we use to measure the size of a file on our computer. How many megabytes is it, right? It's based on how much new information it contains. And that's why we have the news, you know? And I think when a human is in a situation that is so profoundly overwhelming, like they see someone get mutilated right in front of them, that's just something that is just, that's just information overload, and they go into shock. I mean, their brain has to literally reboot, you know?
Or compartmentalize. That's the whole like Sybil kind of thing. You fracture.
Sure. Well, I think that's an after effect of that initial trauma.
It's like
right?
a coping skill. It's like, oh, yeah, I'm just gonna mute that track and not focus on it. Well, it's funny because we're our senses are limited in terms of what they can, and you know, witness in a sense. There's frequency bandwidths we can't hear past, or the spectrum. It's like it's all howling. Like it is like the life itself is this constant present moment of overload, if you want to put it that way. And then we've been fine-tuned to be able to perceive levels of it, and we have, I guess, sine wave punctuationalism or something like that, where it's like we find norms, then we punctuate, then we get a new norm and punctuate. I mean, that's at some point, you know, there was no eyeball on Earth, or presumably, or something like that, and then I guess things adapted, and then you have eyes. You see what I'm saying? It's like it's always changing, and we adapt to it. But if we were to have some, like, you know, this actually is well addressed in the anime Full Metal Alchemist. If you were to like witness things fully as it is, it like you couldn't handle it, like you disintegrate. Exactly. So we have to like temper it and like distort it. Ironically, the true sound of Om or whatever into digestible chunks.
Well, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've thought about this a lot in the terms of the human capacity. I mean, it's a great time that we live in, because the average person on the street now is familiar with basic terms of computational input and output. Like, we understand this idea of bandwidth, and we understand this idea of memory storage and what, you know, capacity, right? Like that we have on our phone or whatever. Do I have 5G and do I have 120 gigs of RAM or whatever? And when you think about it, the human body is a computational machine in the same way, with very, very low bandwidth, right? The eyes have a particular bandwidth, the ears have a particular bandwidth, of which there's a frequency spectrum that they can perceive, and outside, but we have learned that beyond those frequencies, there's a lot of activity that is just, we have to rely on tools and instruments to tell us, to translate them into a frequency range that we can perceive, right? And
well, even like the devil card being like, you guys are gods, but it was like beyond our comprehension or whatever at that time. We're like, what? In that metaphor story, because it's simultaneous. The case is the matter that it's all happening. Whether we as finite kind of filters of the Tao can handle it is different. And it seems, I mean, I don't know about your presuppositions in terms of ontology and stuff, but it's like, it seems like we're well situated in a kind of sliding scale thing. And it's okay. It's wanting to know more through the experience of mutation and like increase in handling or whatever like that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, as far as the Tao, I mean, I'm not an expert on Taoism, but I have been directed towards the Taoist concepts of flow, which is one of the topics I mentioned, and also, this relates to the notion of personal versus cultural synchronicity, and this has been my experience, but it seems to me that what I have learned over the last several years, where I've been hyper aware of these types of things and these phenomena, is that there does exist a potential in human beings to tap into this ongoing stream of phenomena that is happening all around any one of us at any given time. This is often misinterpreted by, you know, psychoanalysts as symptomatic of schizophrenia or something like that. But I have had fleeting periods where I have this hyper awareness of any form of stimuli that I can perceive, whether it's a bird chirping outside my window, whether it's an email arriving in my inbox, whether it's my wife coming up to talk to me, whether it's a car honking, you know, down the street, anything that I can perceive is actually valuable information that I can use. And there is the potential for any person to develop and master this kind of instrument of perception to the point where they are basically walking through reality, experiencing it like Neo at the end of the first Matrix, where he sees everything in code, where every fragment of your perception has some underlying meaning to it that can guide you and you can literally ride that wave like a surfer. And that is my conception of Taoist flow, is when you can tap into that stream and utilize every single stimuli that your mind and your consciousness is picking up, no matter how big or small or insignificant it may seem.
Right,
As you mentioned, schizophrenia, and on the most, I do conscious channelings, and in the most recent sessions, quite a few, actually only new individuals turned up, and it quickly became apparent that the topic was going to be psychosis, and dealing with psychosis and perspectives on psychosis. The idea that came through basically was very simple. The idea being, of course, it's a great question: who is determining you to be psychotic? What is their own boundaries of their own thinking, and can they relate to it? And one of the questioners also mentioned that for them it actually more felt like a shamanic or trance states. But of course, a doctor who's not used to ayahuasca or whatever is just going to say, oh, you're psychotic, take these drugs, right?
Exactly. So, that's what I've been told.
Okay, great. And maybe to relate all of this and to provide some, heavy historic reference, if you would like, I would read 3 paragraphs from Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, because he's talking about exactly that, about psychosis, and also about perception and information overload, and how we deal with this individually. Kindly, if you may mute yourself, just so that I'm not distracted by any background noise.
Yes.
Talking about noise, so this is a recurring subject here as well. Thank you so much. So here it says, in Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, page about 16. Most takers of masculine experience only the heavenly part of schizophrenia. The drug brings hell and purgatory only to those who have had a recent cause of jaundice, or who suffer from periodical depressions or a chronic anxiety. If, like the other drugs of remotely comparable power, masculine were notoriously toxic, the taking of it would be enough of itself to cause anxiety. But the reasonably healthy person knows in advance that, so far as he is concerned, masculine is completely innocuous, that its effects will pass off after 8 or 10 hours, leaving no hangover and consequently no craving for a renewal of the dose. Fortified by this knowledge, he embarks upon the experiment without fear. In other words, without any disposition to convert an unprecedentedly strange and other than human experience into something appalling, something actually diabolical. Confronted by a chair which looked like the Last Judgment, or to be more accurate, by a Last Judgment which, after a long time and with considerable difficulty, I recognized as a chair, I found myself all at once on the brink of panic. This, I suddenly felt, was going too far. Too far, even though the going was into intenser beauty, deeper significance. The fear, as I analyze in retrospect, was of being overwhelmed, of disintegrating under a pressure of reality greater than a mind, accustomed to living most of the time in a cozy world of symbols, could possibly bear. The literature of religious experience abounds in references to the pains and terrors overwhelming those who have come too suddenly, face to face, with some manifestation of the mysterium tremendum. In theological language, this fear is due to the incompatibility between man's egotism and the divine purity, between man's self-aggravated separateness and the infinity of God. Following Böhme and William Law, we may say that by unregenerate souls, the divine light at its full blaze can be apprehended only as a burning purgatorial fire. An almost identical doctrine is to be found in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where the departed soul is described as shrinking in agony from the pure light of the void, and even from the lesser, tempered lights, in order to rush headlong into the comforting darkness of selfhood as a reborn human being, or even as a beast, an unhappy ghost, a denizen of hell. Anything rather than burning brightness of unmitigated reality. Anything.
Well, shit, there it is. I mean, the Tao that could be named is not the Tao, and it seems that which is, and it's got an infinite number of bandwidths, and when we start kind of punctuating through those, our our symbol sets and our reason and everything starts freaking out to the point where we try to hide from it.
Absolutely. Wait, am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're good. You can talk.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry. Yeah, that's great.
I haven't read that book particularly. Aldous Huxley's obviously kind of a psychonaut's friend or whatever.
It's publicly available. It's a really short read. It's highly recommended.
My mom gave me that book. My mom gave me that book to read when I was a teenager. It's crazy.
Damn, Mom, that's heady.
She's a psychiatrist, so.
Well, she's on the wave. I mean, if she kind of read that
for
shit.
sure.
Well, I mean,
she's on her wave.
Kind of,
let's put it that way.
It's kind of an outlier in my upbringing, but that did happen. But yeah, that's very relevant. Thank you.
Yeah, the only Huxley that I've read is Island, which is a really good fictional book if people haven't read it.
You haven't read Brave New World? Isn't that like mandatory or something?
I should have probably because of schools, but I haven't. No, I read it in 1984, but not Brave New World.
I prefer Brave New World.
That's what I hear. Everyone's like, oh, it's about like drugs that turn you on to like, I mean, it's kind of like what our modern world is, where it's like, just tweak your chemicals and just do this, that, and the other, and stratification.
I think they're doing a new show or an adaptation of Brave New World as a TV series coming out soon. I think I just saw an ad for that.
So it sounds like your preference, especially musically, given what I know little about the music you make and stuff, is that you don't mind sticking your head into the howling, all of it. How do you, Wally, kind of step down from the pure awareness yourself? Like, I do think synchronistic, because let's put it this way, everything is synchronized, right, in some weird way. And then it's a matter of the ability of one person at a certain time space to apprehend these things, and then their choice also at some level. So it's like you can go further and like, come into like Lieutenant Dan moments of gnosis if you deal with the storm or whatever. But a lot of people get scared about the storm, and then it gets into like we listen to our own old Georgie in a sense, which is kind of like a devil card, I guess. But in Cloud Atlas, old Georgie's this like primal fear where it's like, hey, don't do that, you're gonna get fucked up or whatever at some level. And it's like it's not untrue, but it's like it's leaning into a certain statistical kind of arena or quadrant. It's like there's more than that quadrant, but like it's for self-preservation that it makes that more explicit. What are your thoughts on anything I'm saying and what I kind of asked in terms of like how do you surf the Tao?
It's very dangerous. I mean, I have had some very bad experiences trying to ride those waves in the past, and it is something that I think, in my experience, most people who have chased that it has not ended well for them. I think the people who have succeeded in chasing that and being able to maintain that wave indefinitely are not necessarily the type of people who make that readily apparent. I think that my biggest mistake in the past, when I even saw that wave coming at me and became aware of my desire and intent to ride it, the mistake I made was this overwhelming sense of urgency that I had to alert everyone else of its impending arrival, or that it's already here. And I felt, in hindsight, I feel I was very misguided, and instead of with the urge to externalize this awareness instead of internalize it. But basically,
That's a great point.
Yeah, and I think that's the danger that we all face when we discover this.
But would you really say it's a danger? Because the way I see this, both in my journey and what I can glean from others, everyone, has their own preferences and style in a sense. But it almost seems as if, like a flower is blooming, or I don't know, the mycelia is growing or something. And there's a certain point when, even though you're not maybe really know what you're doing, it's actually important and relevant that you tell everyone about it, even though almost no one will understand anything you're saying. But even this will create a different type of a ripple. And of course, then I guess one matures in that approach, just like you mentioned, and notices it's really mainly an internal process. But sometimes I think back and I'm like, I'm pretty sure none of these conversations or, strange phased realities that may occur in these states or when one is on that kind of a wave, I think none of them really are lost in a sense. I really see it ripple through time, like Cloud Atlas style or something. Who knows on what levels? But of course, what you say is equally valid. I'm just saying.
I take your point.
Yeah.
I absolutely take point. I think in my case, and in hindsight, no, I wouldn't be where I am now without having those, what I would, at the time certainly felt like very negative experiences. But since I've had them, as I've grown more aware of what they mean, they've been much more positive. And yeah, I definitely take your point that you could spin the interpretation around as a blessing as opposed to a danger. I think that in my case, I simply had the wrong audience, and there are
right. Who doesn't?
Reality,
right?
Who doesn't? Right. But the unfortunate reality of the status quo of human consciousness is that it is more likely that you're going to encounter adversarial forces.
Jesus was not popular in his hometown.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and so I think that had I had those experiences around open and enlightened people, it would have been a very different outcome for me. But I did not. I was around people that interpreted that as you need to go live in a rubber room, but those things happened and triggered long-term growth that led me to where I am today. So in a sense, maybe they were ultimately positive experiences, but they sure didn't feel like it at the time. They were very difficult. And but yeah, you make a great point. And but I think my strategy in terms of finding a way to continue to safely externalize it is an ongoing developing thing for me, and that's something that I try to incorporate into my art. And I don't know how I continue to ask the question, how overt, how transparent is appropriate for me personally and for others as well. I mean, if somebody comes up on the street to me talking like like they're in the middle of that process.
Oh, totally. And just to briefly reinforce what you're saying, it's just what's described in Aldous Huxley. And one friend with whom we do shows in German, actually, Michaela, Jim knows her as well. She always gives the great example, I guess also from some guru or someone. He's like, well, how well are you going to succeed if you're trying to wake someone up who tries to sleep? Right. And also Bashar relates this funny story, or Daryl, I'm not even sure, about this channel. He's talking about some woman that's really enthralled in this, you create your own reality and all is one and amazing, and she does her best to tell her sister, and then at some point she can see like her sister, I don't know, getting a walk-in. I mean, that's what I'm saying now, but just like some reset of the connection, and then suddenly her sister tells her, "Don't you see? I am not ready to know that yet." And then goes back to her normal self, So it's really, I think it's a great value, like when, you just spring up and you kind of bump everywhere and some ripples occur. But then as soon as you catch the drift that that's not really what it's about, and that you can't really, force anyone into anything, the very least, the reflection of self and evolution of consciousness, then I guess it's even just out of, how should I say, maintaining one's own joy, that one will naturally, adjust these styles of communication, just like you say, not walk up to anyone, shine a bright light in their face,
Exactly, because and you never know who's open to receiving it or not. And I think that there's an element of volunteerism behind it. Like I think people need to surrender a certain aspect of themselves and their sense of self to in order to be genuinely open to that type of perception and growth. And also, I think that we live in the age of instant gratification, and I certainly was seduced by that. Like it's impossible to avoid being raised in developed countries in the Western world in our era. And I think that fed into this intense, overwhelming sense of urgency I had. I was like, I instantly need to go out and declare to the world, and they're going to get it right away, and it doesn't work like that. It's
tricky because personality is involved. You know what I mean? We're
Right.
So there's driving is X. It's like someone with a lead foot is going to drive differently than someone with like nearsightedness. You know what I mean? Like everybody's conditions of the information flow necessarily cause that message to be distorted. So in a sense, like that's what I think maybe one of the what the Tao that can be named isn't the Tao, because it's like everything that's naming is trying or even describing or kind of trying to relay for whatever reasons, whether it was you were sincerely trying to express, a belief you had versus maybe like inflated, grandiose ego moments or anywhere in between, or like all the colors, right? It's hard to know, because I think what this is boiling down to is like our inability to trust. And the story of the devil or whatever is like, don't just trust anything. Like there's wolves in sheep's clothing. There's actually viruses out there that'll fuck you up and all this shit. And maybe in a sense there, we tell ourselves stories like, don't pick up, literally rattlesnakes, they'll bite you, you'll die. And we like tell stories to inculcate these kind of myths that like allow more, gene spreading to occur or whatever the fuck.
Right.
But
we've also anthropomorphized a moral spectrum onto those things that where they may not exist. A rattlesnake is just acting in its own self-interest of self-preservation, and wars are fought between two sides that are both just fighting for what they believe is right, and natural forces they're value neutral. They don't, and yet we assign this moral spectrum to all of these external events where they don't necessarily exist.
Right, because we don't trust the process. That's kind of what I'm getting at. It's like it's all exactly. Good, and then we start being like, well, I have a good I want to maintain, and whenever that like gets distorted in a sense, that's not good. Right. So in a sense, like for example, like the sun dying out one day or us getting engulfed in a black hole, like we would say that's not ideal, obviously for many reasons. But like the point is like if it's the case, it is what it is. Like you kind of just have to accept it in some weird way. And I think, just like in the I Ching, there's like hexagrams that are very benevolent in a sense, and there's hexagrams that are very not helpful, but like it's all part of the song and dance. And I don't think I think it's a natural consequence of evolution to anthropomorphize. I don't even like demonize that in a sense.
Well, human morality is a product of evolution, and it serves a function as a social function. For there's a evolutionary basis for morality. I mean, even in chimpanzees and lesser primates, you find that even in all other forms of life, there are basic moralistic systems that exist because it serves the greater interest of survival, of fitness, So it's not without nothing, but I take your point for sure. It is about acceptance and surrendering to a certain extent in order.
Well, it's fucking easier than it sounds. Like we say it rather nonchalantly, but it's like try doing that at the peak of an acid trip, or like when you're telling your friends and family that you see the way or whatever. And it's. I think what
do they need to know? That's what I'm saying. It's like, do they even need to know?
I'm curious what Raphael thinks, because at some level, on the one hand, it's up to you. I mean, I guess the energy dance that'll play out happens because of the chemistry. So if you bring, sodium to the table and their potassium, and it's like alchemy, right?
Well, let me put it this way: reality is organized in terms of information sharing, just like the top projects in the CIA, or what they call what is it? Not just black projects, but there's an even better word. Anyhow, everything is compartmentalized perfectly because we live in the illusion of separation for the joy of it. And therefore, everyone will always only know exactly what they need to know basis. So in a sense, I mean, I see those that are aware, or they can, let's say, have reasonable excitement, let's just say, in making the information accessible and the awareness to the best of their abilities, which is, I would say, what we are all doing, even just by participating in this podcast. However, this does not necessarily mean, pushing it on anyone, or like we said, shining the light in someone's face who really wants to sleep. So I think there's a differentiation to be had right there.
Well, Raphael, it takes that point takes us back to one of the very first things you said, and that discernment is key. I mean, I think it's interesting how we've evolved to like you described. We compartmentalize, we break down, we categorize, we classify, and this is, I mean, discernment is the last. I've talked about this a lot. One of the last inborn instincts human beings have is discernment. When you were born, the only program that still exists in your ancient part of your brain is to literally to find your mother's nipple, and that's why the areola is darker than the surrounding skin on a woman's breast, on a mother's breast, is because the only
targeted.
You have very limited eyesight as a newborn, and you can only distinguish figure from ground, and that is the essential nourishment that you need to survive. And so all of our other instinctive behaviors have been externalized on, we've stored them in the naturally occurring storage medium of culture. Every other instinctual behavior, the only one that remains is discernment, is being able to separate, right? And so that's the great challenge that we're trying to overcome, I think. And when we have these fleeting glimpses of the totality of interconnectivity and synchronicity of the universe, that's the great challenge of our life that we're facing, is that, I am equipped with this hardwired software and hardware that is designed to separate, when in reality, at this peak of my acid trip or whatever, I'm perceiving what reality actually is. And so I think to me, I boil it down to that fundamental challenge.
So this gets into a funny place, because it's like, all right, if the monkey can't see the nipple, it does. If one thinks that's the only time it would exist, it's less preferable to do that. So we would put a moral slant on it to the degree that it's like, you should see the target, try to get the target. Whereas if it's all just the one thing experiencing itself constantly and moving like a river or whatever, it's like sometimes it sees it, sometimes it doesn't. If we want to go this way eventually, like, it will need to see the target more than not. So yeah, make that a preference, I guess, of behavior. Raphael, I'm kind of curious as to your because we're talking about this two ways. On the one hand, like, we're saying maybe good and bad is perspective, but then it seems that there's discernment would be like, there's times for both happen, but there's times when one is more necessary for an outcome that's desired than another. This gets into desire versus impulse.
Just briefly, we have to differentiate between or again discern. Apply the separation to recognize the unity. No, I have to discern in this case between the labeling or judgment of good and bad, which is judgment basically, or labeling, a classification, and between the, let's say, mechanical underpinnings in terms of polarization, positive or negative. Those are different things, and may be interpreted as good or bad, again, depending on a certain culture. So that's a difference here. And it's certain that we need positive and negative polarity, even functionally, even for any system. You need some kind of an output if you also have input, some kind of negative feedback if you have positive feedback. Even if, like the Sasani say, for example, they run a 99% or 0.9 positive synchronicity. And again, they leave a tiny aspect, of noise, right? So just for novelty, but it's really minimized and it's not labeled as negative or bad. So number one is the labeling, and number two is just what kind of choice one makes for oneself and for one's own society, whether to run off of negative synchronicity or positive synchronicity, or in what balance these should be held. Does it make sense, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that came to mind is like, okay, so this group of people over here don't know that Vesuvius is like toxic chemically, like there's noxious fumes that'll kill you and it could blow up and kill you and all this shit, and it happens. I guess I'm still looking at like life as preferential to non-life in a weird way. So I'm like,
sure, and you can do that. But what I just want to say is, even if you do that, then number one, it makes sense not just to label too much as bad in a negative sense, just because of also, let's say, emotional capacity that this may consume. But then overall, you can just make a choice and can say, okay, I focus on positive polarization, constructivity, communication, and inclusion, and I choose to grow and live with that. That's perfectly fine. But even within that, you will have
knowing
some
full well distortions occur.
Well, not just this, but even technically, you need the negative polarization. Like if I would only have the positive, I would not in a sense, let's say, now start taking a breath, and never exhale again. It's not going to be so great. Yeah. So, and there's really a limit, let's say a great degree of variability in terms of how much negativity you want. And certainly humans have been heavily unbalanced on that to the negative side as well, let's say, or much more than my individual preference. I just want to say that technically you will still have, just like in the yin yang, some aspect of negative polarization, even technically, even though that doesn't have to be some grand destruction or something, but you actually need some degree of separation even to just have an experience and create a story. And with that having kept in mind, then also the excess negativity, even though we can see we don't prefer it, we can recognize its value and purpose more, because especially now we could say it is, well, separation and decay in a sense. But many of those things now we could observe are, well, in a sense, not really separated, but to be left like, compost, or however you call it in English, on top.
Well, I guess the idea that comes to mind a little is the parable in the Bible about, like, if you want to have fruit out of the seed, you got to kill the seed or something. So it's like, and it's obvious, but what we're kind of getting at is this acceptance of, like, there's a time and a place for kind of everything. Wally, I'm kind of curious how you're looking at, and not to just jump ships completely, but I'm seeing a kind of a thread in my own mind, at least, with, like, synchronicities happen. There's good things, there's bad things. We can get into, like, culturally relative ones or personal ones, like what you would desire versus, larger scale stuff. But before I get into synchronicity, maybe I'm curious as to why you wanted to talk about God as information. What does that mean to you?
Well, that's a big topic. I think it's important, as far as my point of view is concerned, in a lot of these discussions that are being had in these circles, there is a clear distinction made between a kind of materialist versus idealist worldview, and the types of people that we find ourselves often speaking with, I would think, feel somewhat attacked by the or at least dismissed outright by the materialist worldview. I personally, I don't discredit either. I in the same way that I don't discredit any style of music, I like to live in the gray area between the two and acknowledge.
You straddle them well. I would say you're the most materialistic sync head I've met in that sense.
Yeah, but I wouldn't consider myself. I mean, I acknowledge the full spectrum. I think that my and my belief system is fundamentally everything is true, and
all truths are true, all perspectives are valid is also Bashar meme in a sense. So
exactly,
sure.
And so on the topic of information, I mean, this is, and in material science, this is very much a hot topic. Quantum information and the importance of physical information, and as we continue to observe material science creep ever so slowly as it does towards realizing that idealism has been right about many things for thousands of years, I observe that very, very gradual creep towards accepting that with a lot of fervor, and I think just as I transitioned over the last decade or more from an atheist to a believer, a lot of that was driven by my interest in information as a fundamental, as the ultimate fundamental building block of the universe and reality as we know it. Information sounds like a very technical term, but essentially, I mean, when you examine a lot of the mystical sides of any of the major religions, Christian mysticism, Jewish mysticism, Islamic mysticism, you can extract a lot of language that deals with language and the transmission of information. I mean, the very opening lines of Genesis are all about the speech of God and the transmission of words and ideas from the mouth of God. That is a fundamental, that is an information transmission act, right? And it's my belief that, as theoretical physicists continue to pursue what happened before what they consider to be the Big Bang, they're going to find that it's just an endless ocean of information that was lying in stasis, waiting to describe something. That is the function of information. It's blueprints. It's endless, infinite descriptive capacity. And so that, as succinctly as I can, kind of sums up what I mean by God is information. And I think that human beings are an extension of that reality in their capacity, an infinite capacity to create information, transmit information, process information, transform it, store it, recall it, and once again, that takes me back to my enjoyment of the current era we're in, where there's more and more kind of just common awareness of how information is handled in reality.
Do you think we have an objective understanding of that, or is that a human-based understanding of information? Obviously, we have an understanding of kind of what we perceive it to be, but is there an infrared bandwidth of truth that we just aren't capable of cracking?
No, I think that we are. I don't know that most people, I think, are. I think that there are powers and interests in the material realm that use that very fact to misguide or to just misdirect most people with information. I mean, everyone's processing and everyone is contributing to the flow and to the constant mutation and transference of information. There are magicians and shamans and adepts who are doing it very consciously, and then there's everyone else who are doing it unconsciously or only to much lesser degrees of consciousness or awareness. But everyone is participating all the time, forever, and always have. And this is why synchronicities rise up into our awareness, I think, because people without realizing it are contributing to these of laws of attraction that pull together events and individuals and objects into alignment that one of us, any individual person, may encounter or stumble upon and perceive as a very meaningful but also very personal synchronicity. And that's also why I'm interested in that distinction between kind of macro and micro synchronicities, because highly personal synchronicities are ones that are very difficult to share that experience.
The pearls to swine scenario, it's the worst.
Yeah.
When you're like, yo,
right.
I saw this shit, and everyone's like, that has no value in my system, I'm sorry.
Exactly. And then that person who just dismissed you has their own and is suddenly in the same position.
Although I would say with things like numerology that luckily some people get into, we may actually be able to start developing like common languages or reference points. Like, for example, one very dear friend of ours, let's say in our also, how should I say, spiritual, in the best sense, pirate group locally, where we just do events and I do the channelings and we have, different workshops and different devices like frequency healing tech. Anyhow, one of the founders actually died, and whole backstory and so on. But anyhow, then some people were getting connections through him or information in a sense from him, whatever this means exactly, right? We can speculate, but like distinct individuals having this recognition. And one of the ways one can then easily talk about it, for example, is through numbers. So for example, in his case, he was tightly associated with 777. And I wanted to go to a demonstration actually in the inner city. And as always in the inner city, I walk the wrong way, even though GPS is open and, whatever, I just go wherever, right? And with my headphones in. And then I suddenly look up and there's a guy and apparently he really wants to talk to me and he already looks interesting. And we're right in front of a super nice, stylish, like white Land Rover or something that says Vienna, in this case a W, but with Vienna it would actually be V, which would be his complete signature, and then 777. And the first thing this guy says is like, oh, do you know the place where you can read about all of this? And I guess he said that because I was dressed all colorful and so on, And I was like, yeah, I think I know the place. And we just talked for a bit. He dropped some crazy Harry Potter references I didn't catch completely, but enough, to jive with it. So I basically just, obviously met a magician right in front of that symbol. So it's in a sense personal, but through the numbers, it can be, I guess, easier to relay. And, but at the same time, it's so relevant what you mentioned that everyone considers this. But I think the more one is on that journey, the more compassionate and open one becomes to more and more obscure interpretational lines of reasonings. Like many of those research subjects that I'm into, I could never have gotten into if I wouldn't have built that capacity, which, like kind of starts from both understanding, let's say, a left wing and the right wing ideology, or to both understand the ideas of capitalism, communism, and technocracy and communitarianism or whatever. That's where it starts. And eventually it goes up to, oh, you see aliens. Oh, you see this strange sliver of a light because of whatever. But when one realizes how individually that journey is and that we are living within our own belief systems and one can account for that, then it's much easier to be able to jive with someone, even if I don't have the same references, because I know I just have to assume it to understand, what's happening, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very well put. And I think it's true. I mean, for some people, I've encountered a lot of, in terms of the numbers being a common reference point, some people really resonate with that idea and others don't. I've a good friend of mine, and I think I'm not sure if you guys have spoken directly with him or not, but you guys may be familiar with Znor.
Oh yeah, I'm trying to get him on here. He's in Japan. What up, Znor? Shout out.
And I love the guy to death. And I think, but one of our disagreements, or I wouldn't call it a disagreement. Actually, it's just
perspective differences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, perhaps maybe it's not even that, but what, we were talking about, or I was asking about, what comes first, numbers or words, or what came first, numbers or words? And he's like, words, definitely. And I was like, okay, but you just counted. I mean, the question itself, what comes first? The word first refers to counting. You're putting something in an order. So, there is no distinction ultimately. Like, as soon as something comes, it's been ordered, right? So, I mean, there's such a thing. I mean, the word first is an ordinal term versus the cardinal numbers. There's cardinal numbers and ordinal numbers, and cardinal numbers are just 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're representing a quantity. Ordinal numbers are first, second, third, and fourth, representing a sequence.
Teleology or something, yeah.
Right, a sequence basically. And so it was a trick question, and I'm like, so what came first, words or numbers? And both is the answer. But yeah, I think numbers are for the most part a great reference point for those kind of riding the wave and those watching from the beach, so to speak. to your
Well,
point,
they help give
Raphael.
timestamps in a sense, right? Like I think they can kind of be
Exactly.
resonating points, but then like what you're kind of getting to, and I guess it's like what comes first, particle or wave? It's like it depends on your perspective, and maybe in a universe there's all number and it bleeds into words eventually, and maybe in a one universe like it's all words and they articulate to a point of sequentiality at some point or whatever.
Yeah, and numbers are a fundamental unit of information, right? I mean, that's like how much more granular can you get than just, you know, a quantity, right? I mean, just the numbers themselves the symbols that we write down, the numerals, those are words more than they are numbers. You know, they are symbols that represent some abstract quantity that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a limited quantity. You know, that's discernment. We're separating the one into the many, right?
Well, I was going to say that's. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, Raphael's always saying this, and like it's hard to phenomenologically grok it. Like when the penny drops, it hits, and it's like you don't have to shout it out to the world. You smile at those who get it. You have the Buddha smile, whatever. Well, it seems like I'm imagining a circle of the totality that all that is, and all that ever will be, and all that can, whatever, the one circle, we'll just say. And then within that circle is, imagine black and white or whatever. And I guess it's just like it's a sine wave or something that's switch. I mean, it's like a yin yang is obviously a similar thing, but it's like you have total unity, like that would be all white, right? We'll just say, and then it starts shifting like pixel by pixel within the circle or whatever into darkness, and it's not that the circle's changed really, it's just the values within it are. And maybe at some point you come in, like when people talk about like Kali Yugas and stuff like that, or maybe before conscious, it seems like the circle always is and was and will be, and then the variation of a polarity within this thing is going through kind of saturation differentiations, I guess you could say. So when we're like, oh, we're going to a New Jerusalem or something, it's like we're going, or going from Kali Yuga to like whatever, a better Yuga, a golden age. It's like, well, we feel like we're in more darkness, and then the light is increasing. And then when you in these golden ages where it shifts out of that or whatever, it's like the darkness. You see what I'm saying? So it's like the information, it's always there, and then it's a matter of awareness of it.
Well, because our perception is linear, right? I mean, and we can only, and our sensory perception and our conscious perception is based on a linear flow of before, now, and after, and but all time is, all past, present, and future is existing simultaneously. But for some reason, it has benefited our survival to once again discern that simultaneity as discrete units that are passing by. And the wave in that simultaneous realm probably doesn't even exist as we perceive it. The wave is our perception of, it's like the inhale exhale. It's the contraction and expansion. It's the big bang and the big crunch. I mean, it's all of those things, but for some reason we perceive that as happening along an arrow of time.
Well, I guess the Alan Watts sense, because the thing that's coming to mind is like this total white circle, and then like say 1 pixel's black. The whiteness compared to the perception of the perspective of the black is going to have, left to center to right or whatever, past, present, future. You're going to see it in context to itself in a sense. And it, like, and you know how they're like, oh, in a vacuum, it's got to be filled up or whatever. I guess if there's this like pixel of vacuousness, which is fine, it's still within the the spectrum of possibility within the circle. When it's just 1 pixel of that in the whole thing, all the white is falling into it. I mean, it's witnessed in a sense, and maybe in an Alan Watts sense, it's like it's all happening now, but like I guess it's kind of a Easter egg hunt, it seems, of perception and awareness to like crawl through the mechanisms of our meat suits and time and space and all this shit. Like it's more entertaining, and I guess in a sense of, in a way, kind of like I guess you could have all the keys on the keyboard play at once, but like we find that a lot less entertaining, I guess, than melodies over time or whatever.
Yeah, well, it also, like I said, human beings are this extension of God as information, right? And I think that it benefits. I think that if there is any, if there is any goal that
the transcendental object at the end of time kind of thing.
If there's any cosmic goal at play here, it is the dispersal and expansion and rebirth and reuse and of information itself. And human beings have shown throughout history that they are, if there's one thing that they do well, it's that. But all nature does that. I mean, even the transfer of seeds to the soil is a transmission of information. It's genetic information being passed on, and that cycle is just this of life that we talk. Things have to die and be reborn. We are, we decompose into the ground and contribute to the nutrients of the soil. That's all just this cyclical transmission and recycling of information, right? And then but that information is manifest into matter itself. Matter is simply just is media. Matter is media. It's a storage of information, and that's even a more concise way of describing what I mean by God is information. I mean, information is the underpinning material, but it's not even, it's an immaterial thing that gloms itself on, matter comes into being by information describing it, and in a very kind of cosmic fundamental sense of the term, and that's my belief.
I could dig it. I mean, the thing that keeps coming to my mind now with this whole like white and grains of sand to black, whatever, is like an hourglass. I mean, it's all up on the top. Let's just say that's information as such. It's all white, right? Or however, it doesn't really matter. And then it's like it has to pass through a moment, I guess, that middle part. And what it has is, quote, pass through, and it's actualized, I guess you could say.
Yes.
And then that's what this material universe is.
It's turning from a 0 to a 1.
Flip over.
It's a bit. It's a bit. It really is. I mean, it's the 0 and the 1.
Well, ironically, the 0 and the 1 are held within something beyond those capacitors, if that makes sense.
And I think there's some kind of an argument in terms of also AI, takeover, and I don't know. Let's say, I'm just dropping these words now, binary and non-binary. Again, this may go down many different paths just because that's become a more common term now. But the idea actually of binary and trinity, for lack of a better term.
Or tertiary.
Yes, yes. And the idea being that the one thing is like, the Sith or the old style thinking of, on, off, good, evil.
Yes.
And the third aspect is more almost like the spiritual connection or the corpus callosum or whatever, and that we are actually biologically a 3-part, let's say, consciousness, right, or a Trinitarian consciousness, and and some aspects are attempting to squeeze us into a binary consciousness, binary mode of thinking, binary being, becoming a cyborg, replacing yourself with chips, or then potentially this advanced capacity of the Trinitarian aspect may get lost and may actually be a downgrade. And this doesn't have to be, AI or cyborgs. This is even just media and manipulation and propaganda, right?
Right. Well, you can't, binary, I've always found, binary is actually tertiary. You can't talk about 0 and 1 without the word "and." That you need that third element. You need that third element to even be able to express the concept of 0 and 1. You can't, 0, 1, or
they have a relationship that's outside of their individuality.
It's that binding agent that for linguistically we use the word "and," but it's a binding, that third binding agent that once again also discerns between the two is in my opinion more fundamental than those two individual elements, right? So to your point of the tertiary reality, and that's right in keeping with my operating system for sure.
The in between.
Oh, go ahead, Raphael. Yeah, the in between. That's what I was saying. It's like on the top of the hourglass, it's like full. On the bottom, it's empty, and then there's the process therein. But to be able to witness either is the and.
And like you're to carry on your hourglass metaphor, it's that moment, that momentary point in between where the sand is passing that actualizes either side.
Exactly. And that's maybe what 3D reality is. It's just like kind of in between modality where it's like everything that is will become something else, and it's just this Ouroboros kind of forever thing. I'm okay with that. I mean, it seems like the mystics, I forget where I read it, but it's like, the mystic knows 1 + 1 is 3 always. It's kind of what we're saying, where it's just like there's duality is like a phase to go through from the unity to the trinary. Like it's just a point of discretion, a polarization. I mean, obviously you need poles and spectrum to like kind of explain, it seems. And it's so obvious.
Let me just say
beautiful
that
and weird. It's just funny.
The idea of the over dramatization is the issue of third density, because having polarity is great. You need it for creation and experience, but then labeling half of it as completely undesirable, not understanding the mechanics and so on, that's what creates the issue. And and again, human design is the science of individuation. The third density is the density of separation. But again, seen from a higher perspective, this is actually a type of discernment, because I would still contend, especially with the binary way of thinking, that most or many still are kept actually in a second chakra bandwidth, which is closer, let's say, to animal or herd mentality from the lower level. And there the actual point would first be to really develop an individuality, which would be a solar plexus third density aspect. But to actually really develop that, individuate yourself truly from a collective or something, and then again on the fourth density heart level conjunction, again rejoin with everything. And often we talk about the the rejoining process and the unification process, but it really seems for many the individuation process is simply a prerequisite. And there may also be still something left to do there, because if that had already happened, we wouldn't have these oversimplifications of mass movements and cultures and so on, if you can catch my drift.
I catch it. I acquire your drift, to quote Frank.
Well, it's funny. Nice. It's funny because even what you're talking about earlier with like the epiphanies that you had and you didn't know how to like process them, that is the process of individuation. I mean, that you were separating in a sense, and to not have value on it. It's like it was good. It was appropriate for your dynamic in that moment through the hourglass to operate that way. So in some sense, we should trust that it's all it's all happening for reasons beyond human cognition, maybe even, and if we're able to kind of get to that storyteller mode or director's cut mode or whatever, like it makes everything. I mean, it makes things that are hard and difficult, whether it's elections or holocausts or whatever, a little more digestible. It makes the high watermarks a little more humble, in a sense. Like we don't just get like Beethoven is the shit and let's just all do this, now we'll have a third Reich or whatever. It's like, okay, like realize there's a time and place for it. It seems like I really do think that we're kind of entering an era, and I mean, I'm new age enough where I think we're entering a new era, quite frankly, of perception of the data. The data's always existed and it's kind of swashing around in the hourglass, and we'll have a different appreciation of it, and to be grateful for every element of that process and every location of the particle, or whatever. It's like, wow, when it was up on the top of the hourglass, that's beautiful and it's interesting, and when it passes through the filter, that's crazy, that's a dynamic moment. When it lands, it's not better or worse, or it's a sand grain that's passed or whatever, but that like has value in its own way. And this is kind of maybe what postmodern or metamodern kind of awareness is going to lead to. It was always the case, but we just had to kind of stumble through it. It seems like, you're in a house, but there's no lights, and then we're turning on lights gradually. Now our eyes are adjusting, but we were always in the house.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of thresholds. I mean, I think that you can trace those thresholds throughout history as like once certain things reach a boiling point, we shift into different levels of consciousness, and we're at a scale and a scope and just a sheer abundance of connectivity that is so unprecedented. And I think that I think that we're constantly evolving consciously and culturally towards a higher level of empathic and sympathetic resonance with each other, and I'm optimistic. A lot of people bemoan the current state we're in, where the level of connectivity that we enjoy today has seen the emergence of ancient behavior in terms of tribalism and polarization. But I think that's just a birth pang of our technological and spiritual and adolescence. And I am optimistic about where it will lead. It's going to be a very bumpy road ahead, but those bumps are bumps that are on the map, which means that we're on the right path. That's always,
we can't be off path in that sense.
That's this. Well, we're only on the path, and that was, to speak about the negative experiences I had in the past of temporary, enlightenment leading to crashing and burning. Those moments were also points on a path that I had to traverse, because they're on that they are milestones that I needed to pass to keep me on the right direction, and I think that on a larger scale, as a the human race is currently traversing those similar types of hurdles, but the connectivity that we're seeing, that technology, which in the McLuhan sense is simply an extension of our bodies, and not this external thing. It's just an extension of our bodies, and very much a part of nature, just like a forest or the ocean is leading us, I hope, to that kind of cloud of and just simmering landscape of empathic and sympathetic resonance more and more. But we've got to tune the guitar, so to speak.
The idea that came to mind when you were saying this, because it's like the hourglass has a function, it's going to go one way, and the perceived effect of the speed and maybe momentum or whatever when the hourglass first gets flipped and there's a few grains going on, like that process is always going on, but overall it doesn't look destabilizing, particularly to the sand up above. But by the time you get to the last few grains, or whatever, it's like they're falling very quickly. And what I mean? It's like, and that's kind of where we're at right now. It's kind of a
the night is darkest before the dawn.
Yeah, and then this shit. I'm optimistic too, but I think it's just like we asked for the most ratchet film, basically, and it's like, I guess this is how it looks. You'll process through culture and polarity, and there will be all these pendulum swings in multi-dimensional directions, and it's the few grain. Like we're at the the last bit of the sand hourglass. It seems the end of time potentially, even in astronomy. I think NASA, which some people may credit or not, is saying that Saturn's rings are dissolving. That's an esoteric symbol of order and time and stuff. We're getting into this place of especially with VR, psychedelics becoming legal, TV show reality presidents, all this kind of thing. Like it's just getting. McKenna hit it. It's like we're past a threshold of singularity where like novelty is just going to keep getting crazier and crazier. So those sand grains that are towards the back end of the the process of the time hourglass analogy experienced dramatic shift quickly, as opposed to maybe the one when they were on top, when the sand was full or whatever. It didn't feel that crazy for amoebas to turn into fucking whatever, like that kind of process was slow, gradual, whatever. And now the rate of change is so crazy that it's disorienting. But it's, I guess, and this is a presupposition, it's desired. And it might not be desired in a conscious mind sense, but like we're here, accept it, enjoy the ride, kind of thing. Bill Hicks stuff.
This brings to mind a wonderful Alan Moore quote. You guys,
he's a cool magician. Yeah.
I just successfully pulled it up here. If you'll humor me, I'd like to read it.
Definitely.
As I understand the theory of period information doubling, this states that if we take one period of human information as being the time between the invention of the first hand axe, say around 50,000 BC and 1 AD, then this is one period of information, and we can measure it by how many human inventions we came up with at that time. Then we see how long it takes to how long it takes for us to have twice as many inventions. This means that human information has doubled. As it turns out, after the first 50,000-year period, the second period is about 1,500 years, say around the time of the Renaissance. By then, we had twice as much information. To double again, human information took a couple of hundred years. The period speeds up. Between 1960 and 1970, human information doubled. As I understand it, at the last count, human information was doubling every 18 months. Further to this, there is a point sometime around 2015 where human information is doubling every 1,000th of a second. This means that in each 1,000th of a second, we will have accumulated more information than we have in the entire previous history of the world. At this point, I believe all bets are off. I cannot imagine the kind of culture that exists after such a flashpoint of knowledge. I believe that our culture would probably move into a completely different state. It would move past the boiling point from a fluid culture to a culture of steam. And he said that in 2002. And he was pretty dead on about his prediction.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And
Yeah.
I think we're going into, I mean, this sounds crazy because sometimes I don't want to go off on a rabbit hole here, but like sometimes I'm like very committed to being materially embedded in the system in such a way that I'm like, I have a past, I have a present, I have a future, all this stuff. And then sometimes I just pop out of that just briefly. And sometimes it's with psychedelics, sometimes it's just musing, sometimes it's the power of synchronicity or, you know, out of bodiness or whatever the fuck. But like I pop out of it just enough to be like, oh, that was the impression, that was the imagination, if that makes sense. We were always in the full information, and then we like kind of, it's like in Harry Potter when they have the memories or whatever. It's like we're in the quote real world, and we dip our heads and then back into the past. It's like we were in total information situation, and we dipped our heads into like a sequestered moment or whatever. And it's very, you know, it's an illusion, albeit persistent in that sense, in Einstein's sense. But it's like, I think that's going to start popping more and more. I think basically like where people used to maybe have like daydreams occasionally or whatever and find art as like expression and like ecstatic or, you know, making love or drugs or whatever as like moments. And then like I'm back in my hardwire meat suit shit. I think it's going to be flipping the other way where it's like we're going to basically be like kind of disassociating collectively and getting more and more kind of schizophrenic. It's really well actually articulated in a movie called La Congress. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's like kind of a psychedelic cartoon apocalypse where it's just like identity ceases to mean what it used to. It's information overload, like borders and everything pop. And it's almost this Buddhist epiphany of like namaste incarnate or whatever the fuck happens at the end there. But yeah, it's a fascinating moment. And I think maybe we just have to remind ourselves that, I mean, this is a presupposition. We chose to be here now. Like, right? So it's like, yo, like I asked for the ride, you know, I didn't ask for the kiddie ride. I mean, it was always interesting, you know, even if Paris was freaking out over fucking choreography, that's fascinating or whatever. It's a different kind of fascinating. We're at a time when, you know, the norms are kind of going out the window. And I think we're unable to cope with that, but we're falling into the grace of what already was in a sense. So it's like, it's all good. We can thrash about and have our own apocalypse, and it's going to look weird like Lieutenant Dan and, you know, Forrest Gump, where it's just like, I had a destiny and I had all these expectations and I was holding on to this, that, and the other. And he's got to kind of let it out like a tantrum. But when he does, he comes on the other side of that to this peace. And it's just like, well, it is what it is. And, you know, like we just got to kind of like get the rabid animal out of us, accept it, and then punctuate essentially to like what steam consciousness, like he was saying, like we're going to be different than we have been before, but it was always there anyway, in a sense, in our imaginations or something. And now we're going to fall into an imaginal place, I think, where, like you said, all bets are off. Dreams are, you know, everything's materialized. New age wet dreams don't even start it, right? Like Terrence McKenna was getting into this with the 2012 time wave stuff. I think it's the end of time as we know it, because the hourglass is flipping and we're at the last grains of sand at a certain moment, and it's going to flip, and it's going to be a totally different kind of inundation of information, being on that other side of it. Anyway, I guess we can start wrapping it up. Is there anything that you wanted to touch on that we didn't, or is there anything you know, like that kind of stuff?
No, we covered plenty. That was great.
Word.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, I
Thank you
enjoy
very
it. You're
much.
one of my favorite people. We've very minimally had contact. Like I said, we met up in Boise. We walked through a labyrinth together. That's kind of an initiation of sorts. But yeah, anytime I kind of come into contact with what you do, it's always both fascinating and interesting, but like cool. Like you're an
Thanks,
Aquarius,
man.
so it's like, no, totally. Like I love that you're doing your own thing. You've always done your own thing, it seems. Keep doing your own thing. Just trust the process. I know it's a weird time, and listening to all the other monkeys, it's kind of like Whoville or something. It's like, yeah, they've got stars, they've got moons. It's like, don't listen to all the hype. Just kind of, do your
Whoville? Are
thing.
you talking about Horton Reads a Who?
Oh, I'm conflating things. Dr. Seuss has this one thing where it's like, oh, we have a machine that puts stars on our bellies, and then all the people without
Okay.
stars are like, well, I want that, and then everybody has stars, and like, well, the new thing is to not have stars, so we're removing them or whatever the fuck.
I
And it's
just
like,
read Horton Hears a Who to my daughter the other night. So
well, you're a good dad if you're reading Dr. Seuss. That guy's pretty
oh
well.
yeah.
But I do appreciate you coming on. I want to get you on here at some other point. I think we're
Sure.
having people come on, like Alan and some other people, talk about Kubrick. If you wanted to talk about him specifically, that's later this month or something. But anyway, we'll coordinate something.
Sure.
Some Emmy-winning documentarians coming on who's all about Kubrick, and I was like, oh well, he's not like a sync head or into psychedelics or anything like that. But I'm like, he gets it. If he kind of gets Kubrick, that's an in, if you want to put it that way. So I do appreciate you coming on, giving us your time, and always your
appreciate you
energy,
having
your
me.
insights. For sure, dude. Like I said, you're I kind of feel like a Pokemon collector, and I'm like, that's a rare Pokemon. Like, oh my god, like, holy shit! Like, we get these, Squirtles all the time, but this
It's a
is like
foil
a
card.
Meowth. Yeah, exactly. So thanks for coming
Oh,
on,
you're too
Raphael.
kind.
And Wally, if you got any parting thoughts, spill the beans now.
Let's see. Okay.
Don't worry,
well,
it's not an epitaph. It's not on the grave forever. Just for now.
You've probably already heard me mention this before, Jim, but it's always a fun little tidbit. If you take the Latin spelling of the Tetragrammaton, IHVH, and you draw it as a mirror image, so it's HVHI, HVH, it resembles anatomically correct human teeth. There you go.
Right. Well,
Work that out.
There's one for the pipe kids. Put that in there. And
No,
hop on
it's
that.
really significant because the whole Cadmean myth of the birth of the myth behind the birth of the alphabet is that it came from dragon's teeth. So letters are teeth, and it's right there in the name of God.
That's what's up. We're gonna have an
There's
episode just on
there's
that
some
shit.
food for thought right there. But
Right,
thank you
thank
very
you.
much. This was extremely enjoyable. Raphael and Jim, both of you, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining. Looking very much forward to the next Synchronized Now. And of course, as always, thanks to everyone for listening. Enjoy yourselves.
Enjoy the ride, guys.
Radio Okitalk.